The Dreamer by Pam Muñoz Ryan and Peter Sis. Fire. Laurita! Neftali called from the boys' schoolyard. He waved a paper in the air and then rushed to catch up with her. He handed her the thin newspaper. Uncle Orlando's first edition, printed in another town. It took him almost 3 years, but he did it! I cannot wait to tell him congratulations. And I have my own big news. Before he continued, he bent to pick up something shiny from a muddy stream on the side of the road. Neftali, do you not have enough old keys in your collection? Keys unlock doors, Laurita. One can never have too many. So tell me your big news, she said. He pulled a magazine from beneath the books he carried. I have been made a correspondent for Claridad, the magazine published by the students at the university in Santiago. But you will not be a student there until the fall. That does not matter. Many people contribute. Look inside. One of my articles has been printed about the Mapuche. Claridad wants more. And they want me to distribute their magazine to students here in Temuco to generate support for their causes in Santiago so the writers' voices will be heard. The voices against the government? Said Laurita. You know how Father feels about writing against the government. It is risky. She opened the magazine and thumbed through to find Neftali's article. These people are writing about fairness and justice. They are my heroes, Laurita. They write words that stir people's thoughts. They write about changing what is wrong in the world. They are not only students, but others too. Poets like Rojas and Gonzalez Vera, who champion free speech. Free speech might get you into trouble. Laurita found his article and scanned to the end. Neftali, here by your name it says that you are enrolling in the university to become a poet. That means nothing. It was just the editor's presumption. Neftali, you should hide this. I do not think Father will like the editor's presumption. Neftali sighed. I'm running out of hiding places. When you go to the university, then you can do as you please. I wish that were entirely true, he said, but I will still have to be secretive about my writing. At least I will be disguised as a student of the French language to become a teacher or a translator. He lowered his voice to imitate Father's. To pave the way into the business world. So, Father has given up on the medical profession? Asked Laurita. My math grades, he shrugged. Father changed my destiny to business. At least I will legitimately be able to read French literature. Promise me you will keep up your grades at university, Neftali, or he will not send you an allowance. You are so skinny. You need to eat. Do not worry. I will follow Father's path as long as I can, I promise. A flock of large birds flew overhead. Neftali and Laurita looked up to watch the precision of the beating wings. Can you tell if they are ibises or spoonbills? Asked Laurita. No, they are too far away. Neftali continued to walk, his head tilted back, his eyes upward. When he almost stepped in a huge hole in the street, Laurita grabbed his arm and pulled him to safety. Look where you're going, not at the birds. He steadied himself. Thank you, Laurita. You know, I'm going to miss you when I go to Santiago. She laughed. If you can only stay out of trouble until then. He reached over and ruffled her hair. A few months to stay out of trouble is not too much, even for me. A few days later, Neftali arrived home to find his drawers ransacked and his notebooks strewn all over the floor of his room. Before he could pick them up, Father appeared in the doorway, holding a copy of Claridad. You are no better than your uncle, inflaming the community. He flipped open the magazine to Neftali's article and slapped the page. And what do I read? Not that Neftali Reyes hopes to become, his face puffed up and reddened, anything of consequence. Instead, it says you will be nothing more than a lazy thief. It was a mistake, that is all. It was a mistake to ever allow you to work at any newspaper, said Father. I forbid you to abandon the chance of an acceptable profession. And you will not use my money for such a venture. Do you hear me, Neftali? Neftali looked at the floor. It is only due to my madre's pleading that I have tolerated this hobby of yours. But my lenience is used up. I have listened to Orlando recite your essays time and again at my own table. And when people applaud, it is only out of politeness. Do you know what they are really thinking? They are thinking, what an embarrassment you are to our family. Imagine my humiliation when a shopkeeper brought me this article. He says he chooses not to come to my home any longer if the entire family is dedicated to this cause. Father's face flushed with anger. There will be no more writing in this house. He grabbed a notebook and flung it out the window. Loose papers fluttered from inside as if they were trying to fly. Father flung another notebook and another. Neftali heard them slap the porch. Father dashed around the room, grabbing and tossing. Slap, slap, slap. Father's cheeks were so bloated with rage that he did not even look like himself. Neftali backed away from the uncontrollable frenzy, pressing himself against the wall. What would Father throw out the window next? Neftali himself? When every notebook was gone, Father marched from the room. Neftali sank to his bed and dropped his head into his hands. He hoped that the wind would not abscond with any of his loose pages. He would wait for a while until he was sure Father was not looking. And then he would collect all of the notebooks and papers and hide them someplace where they could never be found. Laurita appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes large with fear. She looked at his disheveled room. Neftali? He looked up. I guess I could not stay out of trouble for long after all. They heard Father's whistle 2 times, 3 times, and over, unstopping. Laurita walked to the window. Has he gone mad? Neftali jumped up and rushed to her side. A plume of smoke drifted upward from the pile of notebooks set on fire in the middle of the street. Neftali yelled, "No!" He bolted from his room, through the house, and jumped from the porch to the yard. In several giant bounds, he stood on the edge of the street, hoping to salvage something, anything, but he dared not reach into the flames. Father stood between him and the makeshift bonfire, his eyes wild, his mouth blowing the whistle again and again. Laurita and Mamadre hurried toward the street. Neighbors peered from windows. Wagon drivers stopped, all watching Neftali's innermost feelings turn to yellow and orange and blue. His thoughts and cares and affections grew singed and curled. The remnants of his soul floated into the sky like gray snowflakes. His despair and fury about injustice flamed upward and disappeared. And there was nothing he could do. The whistle blasted and blasted. Neftali stood defeated. Head and shoulders collapsed. Finally, Father spat out the whistle and yelled, "Now we will see what you become!" Then he stormed into the house. Neftali could not move. It was as if all the breath had been sucked from his body. Dutifully, Mamadre followed Father. The neighbors went back to their lives. The wagons rolled in the street again. Neftali remained still and dazed until Laurita came and stood next to him. Without saying a word, they stepped to the pile of ashes. Neftali nudged them aside with his boot. Underneath, a tiny ember blinked. Where is the heaven of lost stories? A few months later, Neftali sat on the edge of his bed. He held a letter he had received earlier that day, telling him of unsettling news. Rojas, one of the poets Neftali so admired, had been arrested during a student protest and hauled off to prison, where he died. Grief, uncertainty, and disappointment assaulted Neftali. How could a government arrest someone for writing what he knew in his own heart to be true? Should all writers pass along only the beliefs of their government? How could a writer be considered treasonous when all he did was present another view? Were not two views better than one? Was it not better to ask questions of readers and allow them to make up their own minds? He stood and paced, filled with an urgency to respond, to defend, to fight. He waited until later that night when he was sure that father was asleep. He sat in his room with the light of a flickering candle, casting shadows on his walls, and finished a new poem for Claridad. Now he had a dilemma. This poem was to appear next week, not only in the university magazine, but simultaneously in a Santiago newspaper. Father knew many people in Santiago, and Neftali could not take the chance that father would discover he was disobeying him. Besides that, he could not stop thinking about what father had said, that he was an embarrassment to the family. Neftali sighed and put down his pen. He picked up the local Temuco newspaper and read an article about the works of a Czech writer. To Neftali, the writer's name seemed unusual and exotic. If only he had such a name. He wrote the last name on a small piece of paper. Then he read it out loud, again and again. He pulled a book of Italian poetry from his shelf and began to thumb through it, stopping at a page to read about a character named Paolo. Paolo, he said, but it didn't sound quite right. He translated the name into Spanish and nodded, writing it on the paper next to the other name. The names slid off the paper, marched across the room, and draped themselves on the hook on the back of the bedroom door, becoming a suit of fine clothing. Neftali could not resist. He retrieved the suit and tried it on. The pant legs did not need to be hemmed, nor the jacket tailored. The fabric was neither too light nor too heavy. The lapels were the width that he liked. The color was soft enough not to offend, but bright enough to be remembered. The name was not only a perfect solution, it was a perfect fit. He picked up his pen again. At the end of his poem, instead of signing Neftali Reyes, he wrote Pablo Neruda. He would use this name to save father the humiliation of having a son who was a poet. Maybe he would use the name only until he became lost enough to find himself. Maybe he would even keep the name. It might take him places. After all, it had a rhythm, like a locomotive chugging uphill. Pablo Neruda, Pablo Neruda, Pablo Neruda. Does a metamorphosis begin from the outside in or from the inside out? The following morning, he slowly packed his belongings into a metal trunk. Clothes, books, pens, and, of course, something for which he would never be too old, his sheep. He carefully sorted his collection into several storage boxes, taking one box with him and taking the other to Laurita's room for safekeeping. He stood in a doorway and handed her the box. "Do not let it go up in flames." She smiled. "I will guard it with my life. Now, do not say goodbye to me yet. My madre and I are walking you to the station. And hurry, it is time to leave. Did someone come for your trunk?" He nodded. "Everything is ready." Father waited at the door, his dark cape folded over his arm. Neither had spoken to the other since the incident with the notebooks. Father handed him the cape. "I no longer wear it, and you will need it. Stay focused on your studies, Neftali." Taking the cape, he recalled how father had worn it on that first day they had traveled together on the train into the forest. He looked directly into father's eyes and became lost in his gaze. Who was inside? Someone mean and hateful? Or someone so controlled by his own past that he dared not allow anyone he loved to control their own future? Goodbye, Naphtali. Father gave him a curt nod and a stiff embrace. Goodbye, Father, he said. And then he murmured, Naphtali Reyes will not disappoint you. With Mamadre on one side of him and Laurita on the other, he walked toward the platform and the hissing train. Before he boarded, Mamadre gave him the blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders, the one she had bought years ago from the fair that sold Mapuche arts and crafts. To keep you warm, you are still skin and bones. She kissed him on each cheek and hugged him tight. He returned her embrace. But I am strong on the inside, just like you. Then he wrapped Laurita in his arms and swung her around. You must still be my emissary and send me all the gossip from Temuco. She laughed. I promise I will write you every week. The train wheezed. He stepped aboard. That night, and throughout the next day, he rode third class in a car full of peasants. It smelled of damp wool from rain-soaked ponchos and wet feathers from unhappy chickens that had been tucked into baskets. But none of that bothered him, because he was headed to a place of culture, a place with more like-minded people, where being a student and a poet would not be discouraged. From the window, he watched as miles of araucaria trees dwindled to a scattered few. Still, when the last piece of forest disappeared, and all that was left were stark adobe towns, he felt as if a piece of himself had been left behind too. When the train stopped, he gathered his trunk, put on a black, wide-brimmed hat, cloaked himself in Father's cape, and slung Mamadre's blanket over his arm. He stepped down onto the streets of Santiago to make his way in the world. There, in the obscurity of the big city, his writing was as persistent as the weather. Poetry had laid down its path, and he had no choice but to follow. He wrote no matter what his circumstances, when he lived in rooms that were no larger than a cell, when he had barely enough money to eat, and it was so cold that he worshipped Father's cape and Mamadre's blanket, when he had no friends and pulled deep within himself, when his heart was broken, or when he broke another's, when he did not agree with the politics at the university or the politics of his country. He wrote. Although he had changed his name, his history came with him, even to his writing. The rhythm of his rain-soaked childhood became a sequence of words. His memories of the understory of the great forest burst into lyrical phrases, as resinous as the sap of a pine cone, as crisp as the shell of a beetle. Sentences grew long, then pulled up short, taking on the tempo of the waves upon the shore, or swayed gently, like the plaintive song of a lone harmonica. His fury became essays that pointed, stabbed, and burned. His convictions played out with the monotonous determination of a printing press, and his affections became poems as warm and supple as the wool of a well-loved sheep. Pablo Neruda's poems tramped through the mud. The field worker read his words and said, "His hands have moved the earth as mine have." His poems knocked at the door of mansions. The wealthy read his words and said, "He has climbed up the same ladder." His poems sat at the table of the baker who said, "He knows what I feel while working the bread." His poems marched on cobblestones. The shopkeeper leaned over his counter and read them to his customers and said, "Do you know him? He's my brother." The poems became books that people passed from hand to hand. The books traveled over fences and bridges and across borders, soaring from continent to continent, until he had passed thousands of gifts through a hole in the fence to a multitude of people in every corner of the world. Their wings beating with the same pulse, their hearts eager to feel all that he could dream. Tin, 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 tin.